Greetings, everyone. Welcome to discussion of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, its legacy for American identity in the world today, with our esteemed speaker, the military historian and political writer, Victor Davis Hanson of Stanford Hoover Institution. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship and co-sponsored by the Commonwealth Foundation and the Open Discourses Foundation. If you're interested in more information on programming like tonight's, please email us at dialogue2021@gmail.com or email me here at Bucknell. Professor Hanson will speak for about half an hour, and then for another half an hour, take questions. Questions may be submitted in writing through the Q&A button on your webinar screen. Tonight's program is dedicated to the memory of a young Bucknell graduate named George Raymer, who gave his life in the Korean War while fighting communist totalitarianism. George Raymer graduated from Bucknell in 1950 as a history and political science major and was teaching civics and history at Lewisburg High School, his alma mater, when he volunteered to re-enlist to go to Korea, following an earlier stint in military service during his college years. The citation that he received for his posthumously awarded Medal of Honor highlights the rest of the story, which happened in 1951, a year after his graduation. Unable to hold the position against an immediate, overwhelming, hostile counterattack, he ordered his group to withdraw and single-handedly fought the enemy to furnish cover for his men and for the evacuation of 3 fatally wounded Marines. Severely wounded a second time, Second Lieutenant Raymer refused aid when his men returned to help him, and after ordering them to seek shelter, courageously manned his post until the hostile troops overran his position and he fell mortally wounded. His memory is featured still in the Lewisburg Area High School Hall of Fame and in a memorial bust at the entrance to our Langone Athletic Center on campus and in the Lewisburg Cemetery. George Raymer, as a young civics teacher, journeyed far from his home here in Union County to back up with action his faith, not only in American freedom, but in the human spirit fighting against totalitarianism. He still exemplifies moral courage to us here today, so close to us here on campus and in the area. May our hearts keep close his example in these troubling times. Before introducing our guest, we also want to thank all the veterans watching from our community or elsewhere, whether of Korea or other wars, who have stood up for the American freedoms that Abraham Lincoln articulated so well at Gettysburg in 1863, a short distance south of our campus, where another young Bucknell graduate, Andrew Gregg Tucker, also gave his life for the values of what Lincoln called our republic under God. We also thank for their service to our country, all the members of the Bucknell ROTC and their faculty and staff who are watching this webinar tonight as well. Professor Hanson, thanks so much for being here to talk with us tonight. It's a real honor to host you here online.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to speak just for about 30 minutes on what we call the Korean conflict. It's not one of the 14 countries that the United States had formally declared war on or went to war with. It's not one of the 15 or 16 instances in which the US Congress had authorized a military action. The Senate actually approved a little bit of it and authorized it, but the Congress in total never approved it. It's not one of the 140, I should say it's one of the 140 incidences in which the president authorized force. But what was different, this was the first time that a president said he was acting on the authority, not of the Congress, but of the United Nations. And from June 25th to July 1950 to July 27th, just about 3 years, the United States intervened or went to the assistance of the Republic of South Korea. It was a country of about 20 million people. It had been under, for about a century, Japanese control. And after World War II, the Soviet Union had occupied north of the 38th parallel. That had actually been better developed. It had hydroelectric, better heavy industry. It was closer to China and Russia, and it had about 10 million people. And the agrarian poor South was occupied by the Americans. And you can see that in 1945, no one really understood the consequences of that dual occupation. The United States had a really naive idea about the Soviet Union. We really didn't need them in Asia. They didn't fight until the last 2 weeks of the war. We were afraid at the Yalta conference early in 45 that we would need the Soviet Union to invade Japan, and we didn't really know whether the atomic bomb would work or not, or what would the effect of Curtis LeMay's fire raids over Japan were. But nonetheless, we invited them in, and then once they got in, we rued it very quickly. So after the war was over, there was a 5-year demobilization, de-escalation, where both sides were supposed to leave the area and then give Korea, a unified Korea, its first independent nation. And that didn't happen because the Soviet Union had trained in that 5 years a much larger army of about 250,000. They had sophisticated weaponry from World War II. And there was a great deal of American naivete. We believed that because we had dropped the bomb in 1945 in August and had developed it in July, that we had a monopoly on it. That was rudely, so from 45 to 49, when the Soviet Unions finally dropped their first, we had de-armed after World War II. Harry Truman and his defense secretary, Lewis Johnson, said, you know what, there will be no more war. It's just going to be a matter of jets dropping bombs on each other, and we have the bomb and they don't. So we demobilized about 80% of our defense forces. And at the same time, we had a very naive view of our strategic commitments vis-a-vis our inability to keep them. So, for example, in February, Dean Acheson had inadvertently just said, when asked at the National Press Club, is Korea in our defensive orbit? And he said, no, didn't think much about it, big deal. We didn't have much of an army, but the Soviets and the communist Chinese were very buoyant because China had won its 1945 to 49 Civil War. They were ascendant, they had dropped the bomb, and they had not disarmed. And when they heard that the United States either would not or could not defend Korea, they got emboldened. And the Chinese trained North Korean army went to Mao Zedong, and he was very anxious to invade. And he asked Joseph Stalin if he could have permission. Stalin was very afraid because although he had 7 or 8 atomic bombs, he would not have a hydrogen bomb, which we had until 51. But there was another miscalculation. We didn't know much about the Eastern Front in World War II. So we had won so dramatically in Asia and Europe and Italy and North Africa, and with B-17s and B-29s. We didn't realize that the Soviets had created the most effective tank in the world, the T-34. We didn't realize that their heavy infantry, heavy artillery, was in some ways as good or better than ours. We didn't realize that they had got first claims on German scientists and expertise, and they had a more sophisticated jet fighter. So we had kind of a naivete that we could just send a few troops in and save South Korea because we'd won World War II and we had the bomb. So when they crossed the 38th parallel, the entire South Korean country collapsed. And what was left after about 60 days was a small perimeter Pusan with about 500 Americans with inadequate weapons. And Harry Truman had to make a decision. Do we want to go to war with no army and not much of an air force that's tactical and a navy and he didn't know if he should or not. American people didn't want to do it. They didn't even know where Korea was. But he made the decision to send what we had immediately to Pusan and save that perimeter. And I mean, we scraped the barrel. We went into public parks in the United States and took out monumental Sherman tanks that had been given as war surplus. We went to archives and surplus depots and tried to bring uniforms and old M1s out. And so for the first 60, 70 days of the Pusan perimeter, we were almost wiped out. and Douglas MacArthur was consul in general, if we could use that term, proconsul of the Asian theater in Japan. He never stayed, as he was accused of, never stayed. I think he stayed one night in Korea throughout the whole war, but he decided to save Korea and told the Joint Chiefs he could not only save Korea, but he could destroy the communist North Koreans and their Chinese helpers. And they were not over yet, but they were there. And so he planned this Incheon landing in September, where we landed 100 miles north with what we had. It was a brilliant victory. It liberated the Pusan beefed up perimeter. Between the two pincers, we destroyed, for all practical purposes, the North Korean army, about 300,000 dead, missing, wounded. They fled all the way back to North Korea. We were faced with this decision. Shall we cross the 38th parallel now that the country is going to be united? The North Korean army is destroyed. The Chinese are afraid to intervene. Russia is afraid that we have a strategic edge in nuclear. And so a decision was made to go. So we only had about 200,000 American, which were 90% of the UN force. Unfortunately, when you go up to north, as you look in your map, the Korean peninsula widens and troops get scattered. And October and November, December can be very, very cold. Korea is not Vietnam. It's not Southeast Asia. Its climate is more analogous to Michigan or Wyoming or northern Colorado. So we were sending troops without winter gear into the north, and they were getting closer and closer to Chinese supply lines along the Yalu River border of China and Korea, and they were getting further and further away from their sources of supply near the 38th parallel. And Douglas MacArthur had assured us that the Chinese would not invade. Invade they did in late October, and what ensued was the longest retreat in American military history. We lost about 10,000 to 15,000 troops in the retreat back to the south. All of the area that we had recaptured, we lost again. North of the DMZ, all of North Korea was not going to be unified. It was now in communist hands. The North Koreans had been refitted with Soviet tanks. As I mentioned, the T-34 tank was better than ours. They had heavy artillery. And we started to see MiG-15 jets that were much better, often flown by Russian pilots, much better than not only our World War II Corvairs and Hellcats, but better than our F-80s. And so they had air superiority, which meant we could no longer bomb freely with B-29s. And so it looked pretty grim. And then in December, our Supreme Ground Commander, Walton Walker, was killed. And a lot of people wanted to leave. And the Joint Chiefs sent somebody they were not fond of. He had no expertise in Asia. He'd never been to Asia. He was a 3-star general in World War II, Matthew Ridgway. And it's one of those moments in history where he turned out to be an authentic military genius. So he came in unheralded, landed in December, immediately met with all the troop commanders, said, I'm going to get you warm clothing, we're going to get hot food, we're going to get ready and easy mail accessibility, improved morale. And then he gave great speeches for the month of January and said, we cannot stop them from taking Seoul again, but we can make them pay a price. And he had these defensive lines. They had various names, Line Wyoming and et cetera. And he had these words, Operation Killer, Operation Deadly Force, et cetera. And the idea was as the Americans were rearming and regrouping, they would gradually withdraw to outside of Seoul. Seoul, the capital, would exchange hands 4 times in this war. And sure enough, as he predicted, just as the Americans had overreached and were far from their supply lines, so the North Korean army and the Chinese communists never have, Beijing has never told us how many people they sent north. Best estimates are well over 1 million. And so UN troops were about 350. They were outnumbered 3-1, but they were now about 500 miles from their base of support. And By January, F-86 Sabres were starting to appear. They were roughly comparable with the MiGs. American pilots were better than their Russian counterparts. We re-achieved air superiority. B-29 started to use napalm. We dropped over 1 million tons of high explosive bombs tactically on the North Koreans and Chinese. And then we counterattacked. And by March, we had retaken Seoul, inflicted horrendous damage on the North Korean and Chinese troops. After the war, most people believe there was over 1 million Chinese soldiers were killed and maybe 300 to 400,000 North Koreans. Remember, we lost 35,000 Americans, probably 170,000 South Koreans, but the lethality rates were about 15 to 1 once Ridgway took over. And then we were confronted with a conundrum. Do we go across the 38th parallel, as MacArthur had done the prior fall, and then extend our lines, get closer to China, or do we stay put in the 38th parallel and have a permanent separation? And there was a huge debate. And MacArthur, of course, who had been defeated in the North and who was overall theater commander, said, we have to go north. Ridgway said, if you want to go north, it's fine with me, but we're going to need more troops. We're going to disperse. We're going to get closer to China, and you got to tell the American people what they're in for. But I can win it. The Joint Chiefs decided not to do that. MacArthur objected. He said that there's no substitute for victory. And he not only was removed from command, but the code of military conduct was established to this day, although it's rarely enforced, that no senior commander can disparage, either on active or retired duty, the President of the United States, his commander in chief. And so what happened for the next 2 years? It was sort of a World War I static line where the Americans at certain periods would go 10 or 15 miles beyond the DMZ, establish a fortified area of resistance, and then would come back to the 38th parallel. The Chinese waged about 4 offensives. They were all failed, and superior American artillery, air power, decimated the Chinese troops. It was very important. This had a very important legacy that we didn't appreciate. One thing we thought in Vietnam was that the Chinese were going to intervene any day on behalf of Hanoi, as they had on behalf of Pyongyang, but they didn't. And we know from post-war archives, one of the reasons they didn't, they were terrified of American air power and artillery, and we had no idea they had suffered as many casualties in the Korean War as they did. But Korea remains controversial to this day because it was the first American war where we did not succeed in an American tradition of unconditional surrender from the enemy and total victory. And we didn't ask for unconditional surrender. We didn't even have a treaty. We have today an armistice where both armies ceased in place where they were on the last day of fighting. And there's 2 ways of looking at North Korea. I'll be happy to adjudicate or answer any questions if you have some ambiguity about the final decision. On the one hand, we limited our deaths to 35,000, 135, 40,000 casualties. We saved South Korea. We stopped the ground confidence of the People's Red Army of China. Today, that legacy is a brilliant South Korea that's a democratic state, which was the natural evolutionary trajectory of that country. It gives the world a great deal of good, whether it's Samsung or Kia or Hyundai or sophisticated medicine. People are very prosperous. The North is a total wreck. People are starving, as they always are. They're always threatening. They're a wild card. But the point is, we did save as much as we could at the time, and we reestablished American credibility, and we began to rearm and wise up to the Cold War, which we eventually won. If you don't believe that, you can believe, well, that is true, but however, the greater lesson is we allowed a communist regime to oppress its own people. And after 70 years, we're living with the legacy of the Truman administration not to order Ridgeway northward and to finish the job. And now, as we speak, supposedly the North Korean communist regime violates the space, air and water of Japan, of South Korea, occasionally even sends missiles toward Taiwan. It's said to have 6 to 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The last warning that Barack Obama reputedly said to Donald Trump as he entered office was, your biggest problem will be North Korea because they have the ability to miniaturize a nuclear weapon. We think they have 7 or 8 of them that could reach Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, or Los Angeles. And that argument says we could have taken care of that and not left this legacy. It had another legacy as well. Because we defeated the communist army and because we came in late and had this incredible recovery, there was a great confidence, and because we rearmed, there was a great confidence that we could repeat that in Vietnam. It was very similar in the sense that we had a communist north with a border with China, a democratic or a capitalist or maybe an authoritarian south, however we want to characterize that government, and that we could pour men, blood, spend some blood, spend treasure, put capital, and save South Vietnam. The problem with that is threefold, that, as I said earlier, the environment, the natural landscapes are completely different between the two places. North Korea is more barren, it's open, it is colder, it's not a tropical nation, it's more conducive for the use of US firepower and naval operations. Vietnam was lush, there was jungle, it was a climate that Americans were less used to. But more importantly, the generation that came out of World War II had a more absolutist confidence that they didn't think they had to be perfect to be good. They accepted that there were flaws in American culture, but they shrugged that it's better than the alternative. And there was not wide-scale protest about amorality. If a US B-29 dropped napalm and missed the target, they would say, war is tragic, get over it. If they did the same thing in Vietnam, it was considered a window into the dark American soul. And so Vietnam prompted a cultural revolution, not unlike what we're seeing now in a way that Korea didn't. And I think the architects of the Vietnam War in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations thought that A, that could not happen, and B, as liberal Democrats, they had pretty much taken care of the left, and the left would not protest against their own. And all those were assumptions that turned out to be false. And I think with that, I'm up right about at 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And I'll just sum up. It's a lesson to Americans that when you are very successful, as we were in World War II, you have to be careful of what the Greeks called hubris, because it can lead very quickly to nemesis or retribution. And after World War II, we did not invest in our military. And we thought that because we were Americans and we created the automobile and the motor industry, that we would always have better tanks, we would always have better motorized artillery, we would always have better planes. And we really didn't worry about what we considered was a backward Soviet Union that begged us to save them. After all, we supplied about 20 to 25% of the war material of the Soviet Union. And that was a fatal conceit, and it almost cost us the entire country of South Korea. The other thing is that Americans had a propensity to think that people, once they meet Americans, they're impressed with Americans, and they feel that Americans are so wealthy and so free that everybody wants to be like America, and it's futile to resist our cultural attraction. So after World War II, we had basically saved Europe and saved Asia from itself, and we thought, well, nobody in their right mind would not want to be an American. They all appreciate our role in World War II, and nobody would want to be communist. And we thought we saved the Soviet Union, therefore they're going to be in our debt. And they had a very different attitude, and human nature being what it is. They looked at that magnanimity as naivete and weakness to be exploited, not as goodwill to be reciprocated. So the stronger and more cosmopolitan and international we thought we were, the Soviet Union and communist China thought that we were decadent, we were lazy, we couldn't make the type of sacrifices that they could. So we really misread, as we often do in America today. It's just simply not true that people throughout the world, while they want to come to America and they want our material bounty and our freedom, most people in the world do not want to work hard at the labors of constitutional government, private property, free market economics. It's a hard thing to do in a very diverse society such as our own. So that was a miscalculation. And that's a lesson that we should, I think, take away from the Korean War. The third thing is that the American soldier performed magnificently in Korea. Once we decided to put troops there, we only had about 500 and they were facing 200,000 for about 3 weeks in the Pusan perimeter. And they did not have tanks, and they did not have effective anti-tank weaponry, and they did not have air support, and they held out. And even when they were surprised and they were outnumbered 7-8 to 1, especially the Marine Corps at the Choisan Reservoir, for example, in their retreat, they were able on the retreat in frigid conditions without air support to inflict about 7 times the number of casualties on the enemy that were inflicted on us. And although there were retreats, there was no mass frenzy. And remember, we were facing in Korea enormous logistical problems. We had to supply a country 6,000 miles away by sea and by air. And they, being the communist bloc, had easy logistical support from nearby Russia, which had a border with North Korea, as does China. And more importantly, they didn't, as I said earlier, they had far more equipment, they had not disarmed, and they had veterans of World War II, many millions of them, more than we did. And yet all of that, when it turned out to actual fighting, it turned out that the suburban, the rural, the urban American, who is not part and parcel of a militaristic or revolutionary culture, when it came down to it, they fought as well, in most cases better than totalitarians. That's something to keep in mind as well. One final thing, there was a notion of that post-war leadership, people like Dean Acheson, for example, Secretary of State, or George Marshall, that after World War II, the world was decimated. Western Europe had been occupied by Germany and more or less looted. The Soviet Union had been destroyed. There was no Southeast Asian tiger economy. Japan, the greatest economy there, was completely destroyed. Communist China had destroyed what little progress had been made by the nationalists. Britain had gone socialist, our ally, nationalized most of its key industries. So we were supplying the world with everything from refrigerators to cars to heavy trucks to radios. And that was the heyday of American industry and middle-class suburban one-wage earner life. Detroit, for example, had the greatest GDP growth per annum of any city in the world. And if you looked at Hiroshima in 1945 and looked at Detroit, it was incomprehensible that 50 years later, Detroit might look more like Hiroshima did in 1945, and Hiroshima today might look more like Detroit did in 1946 or 7. So what I'm getting at is there was a sense of confidence and duty and international condescension by the United States that we can save the world from, as we did in World War I and World War II, and we'll do it in the Cold War. And I think in many ways, for a variety of reasons, the Korean conflict reflects that confidence. I'm not sure it's there anymore. I'm not sure today if the Koreans called us up and said we're being invaded, whether we would send 300,000 or 400,000 troops to save it. We might use air power, but it's a question that you might want to consider. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanson, for that really brilliant and concise overview of the Korean War and its significance. Really appreciate it so much. Um, we do have some questions already in the Q&A section. The first one relates to the Korean War. Americans have indeed forgotten our forgotten war. Have the Chinese done similarly?
Have they forgotten the Korean War?
Yes.
No, I don't think they have. I think Chou En-lai and Mao Zedong immediately and during the war were constantly reassessing American willpower. And what they took away from the Communist Party in China, what they took away from that was it's not a very smart thing to get in a land war or any type of conflict that relies on industrial production or high technology, or especially manifested by air or sea. But if you can get into a war of attrition along the DMZ, for example, for 2 years, then the United States does not have the discipline or the popular support or whatever, or the degree of coercion necessary to wage that type of war. In other words, the Chinese came away and says something along the following: Americans were worn out after they lost 35,000 dead, and we lost over 1 million, and we weren't. I think they were, but they said they weren't. So today, I think that's still that fear of American power, especially industrial, technological, military, but eagerness to see America get tied down in the Middle East or tied down in Afghanistan or tied down in Korea any way they can. And that explains a lot of their foreign policy with North Korea. This is sort of a Chinese bulldog that they cut the leash every couple of years and say, I don't know what they got loose. I don't know what they're doing, but they encourage them to tie down American attention and resources, or the Spratly Islands or something like. They're always thinking of areas that they can involve America and stretch us, but they do not want a confrontation with the United States, not after Korea.
We have a question also about, I think, your most recent book, The Case for Trump, which of course relates to next week's presidential election. And maybe I'll preface this question just by, in terms of a connection perhaps with your talk tonight about the legacy of the Korean War. You spoke about that having occurred in a time of American cultural confidence, which is not perhaps what we see today in American culture. Is there any kind of lesson from the legacy of Korea for people thinking about the election next week? Maybe that's too broad of a question, but I'll toss that out to you first, and then there's a more specific question about your book I'll follow up with.
Well, I think Americans then had more confidence in their government, and they were more realistic that we're here on earth for a very short time. We're not perfect, and we do as best as we can. And we have a constitutional system that was envisioned by our founders to empower people, but not because human nature was flawed. The purpose of the Constitution was to separate the powers and protect the individual, but it wasn't to create heaven on earth. And if you look at the administration of Truman, while he was in Korea, and I think he's deserving a great deal of criticism for not rearming and naively believing that a few nuclear weapons would be all we'd ever need, and we could use all of that savings in defense expenditure for social programs. But while he was doing this, he created the CIA. He integrated the troops in Korea. He recognized Israel, and he said all of those decisions were contested, and yet all of them were controversial, and yet there were no widespread. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan, white racists didn't like it, but because of his leadership, they were emasculated. People did not want to recognize, George Marshall didn't want to recognize Israel. None of the Joint Chiefs did. They said it's a strategic mistake. He did it. And what I'm getting at is that we used to have decisive presidential leadership by people who nobody wanted to fight the Cold War. People in his own party Adlai Stevenson said, "This is insane. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people on our behalf in World War II. They're just socialists. They're not communists." And Truman said, "No, Stalin killed 20 million of his own people." And so there were decisive presidents that are making decisions, and there was a bipartisanship. There were acrimony, there were anger, but there wasn't this, I guess what I'm searching for was, there wasn't this national epidemic of sarcasm and irony and skepticism and nihilism, where everybody assumes the worst and everybody's angry at some decision and it's gloom and doom and it's the end of this. There wasn't that at all. And yet, if you look at the lives of our grandparents, our parents that were involved in that generation in terms of their health, their access to medical care, their access to appurtenances like air conditioning or reliable car, they didn't have a fraction of all the material bounty that we enjoy, and yet they seem to be much more confident and less suspicious of each other, less ironic, less eye-rolling people than we are.
There's a more specific question related to the election and your book, The Case for Trump, and then we have other questions about the Korean War to get back to. But this other question asks, in the case for Trump, you described the choice faced by American voters in 2016, this is a paraphrase, as between honest vulgarity and disingenuous civility. Can the same be said in 2020?
I think it is. I think, I don't know whether it's by intent or not, but whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, he is the most audited, investigated, cross-examined, autopsied president in the history. We have 22 months of Robert Mueller and $40 million by the Dream Team, All-Stars, Hunter Killer, supposedly great lawyers. We've had impeachment inquiries. We had the emoluments clause investigation. We had the 25th Amendment. We had Michael Cohen. We've had Stormy. We've had everything. And no one has found that he tried to profit while in office. I know that's a contentious statement. And so and yet we know he tweets too much. His language is sometimes adolescent, little Marco, or, low energy Jeb or Sleepy Joe. We find that supposedly unpresidential. But in the case of Biden, he's good old Joe from Scranton. And he's one of us. But if you actually look at what the Biden family has done, it's been completely unexamined. And when you have an email from perhaps a possible president of the United States that's released, and his son is saying to him, Hunter, and I'm almost quoting verbatim now, to his own, I think it's his niece, says, I'm getting tired of, your request for money. For 30 years, I carry this family. And unlike Pop, I didn't take a 50% cut. And the reference is 50% of the money that was coming in to leverage the power of his office. Or when we talk about Donald Trump as a racist, but because he says things like Haiti's a shithole country, excuse my language. It's crude, but I don't think, if you look at how his policies have been directed, whether it's black colleges or reducing sentencings on drug users or enterprise zones or lowering the African-American unemployment to 5.3, which is a record, and closing the border so you don't have a lot of competition from inexpensive labor. He's empowered the black community, and that's why I think he will get a little bit more support in a way that would be impossible for more sober and judicious candidates like John McCain or Mitt Romney on the Republican side. And yet, when you look at Joe Biden, he is sort of the liberal icon and he supposedly couldn't possibly be racist, but every time he opens his mouth, it's put you all in chains, you ain't black, hey junkie, hey cokehead, the corn pop narrative fictions, goes into a donut shop, says something. So he's very loose with his words, and I'm 67, I followed his career, and he was absolutely determined to use the word predator in the 1990s and have very stiff sentences for drug use, and gave all of these fire and brimstone speeches about busing and everything, which is fine. So what I'm getting at is, yeah, I think the same thing applies, that you're asked for someone who's saying to you, I never had any political or military experience. I'm a Manhattan raconteur. I exaggerate constantly. I engage in character disparagement. But because I'm not one of the political or military class, there are certain advantages. I go right to the quick. And then Joe Biden is saying, I'm a professional. I know how to sound and talk like a politician. But when you actually look at these people's careers, they're not so moral. It's a very hard thing to do. In the book, I suggested that he's sort of Sophoclean, or maybe John Ford Western, where a society decides that they're vulnerable to, whether it's a Magnificent Seven. I'm mentioning movies I know that your audience doesn't watch anymore because they're old guys movies, but Magnificent Seven, Shane, High Noon, where the topos is they bring in a gunslinger to clean up the town because they're afraid they don't have the power, or that would require methods that they're not comfortable with. He does pretty well. And then as he starts to do well and they feel that his utility is less now, that they see the enemy is, or the opponent or the crisis is waning, then they start to become very self-righteous. And that's how all of these Westerns end, whether it's Gary Cooper throwing down his badge, or Shane riding off in the sunset, or whatever, or in The Searchers, John Wayne walking out in the shadows. So I think there's something to that idea, what's going to happen to Trump. I don't know whether it's going to be 2020 or 24. I have a feeling, we shouldn't speculate, I have a feeling that the national vote is going to be very close, or he's going to lose it. And I have a strong feeling that he's got a very good chance to win the Electoral College. And you can see where that's going to put the country with a recently appointed Supreme Court judge. So it's going to be another, I think it could be very contentious. Although a final thought is, our founders were very brilliant people. And one of the arguments for the Electoral College that we never address is they were very worried about national voter fraud. And so they said, whatever fraud it will be isolated by state and not on a national level. And by that, I mean, here in California, it's pretty much, we're used to vote harvesting as Illinois is in New York, and yet it's not going to make a bit of difference in the national Electoral College vote, because we're going to be a blue state no matter how much we have fraudulent elections, and it's not going to affect either candidate's chances. So there was a system of ensuring against national voting fraud that kind of encourages me we can get through this.
Well, earlier you were using some analogies of leadership with Western movie figures, and we have a question from one viewer. What are your favorite characteristics in a leader, and how do you rate Douglas MacArthur's leadership, that relating to the Korean era?
Yeah, I think one of it is that a leader takes risk. He has to be seen with his men. He has to have the idea that he's one with everybody. And Ulysses S. Grant and W.T. Sherman did not dress like failed generals like McClellan or Hooker or others. In other words, they wore dirty clothes. They slept on the ground. George Patton was at the front with his men. He was in a Piper Cup flying over unnecessarily right above the battlefield in airspace that was very dangerous. MacArthur tried to do that. He'd done that very well in World War I, but the problem was he was in his 70s and he wasn't as in good health as he said he was. And he was living a very comfortable life in Tokyo with his wife, very beautiful second wife, and he had a young son. So the idea that a 74-year-old man was going to go over to Korea and sleep out with the men like Ridgway did. Matthew Ridgway was successful because he wore this, they called him, if I could use the term, old iron tits, because on one side he had a medical pack, on the other he had a grenade. And he pulled out a revolver one time and shot an enemy soldier that got close to him while he was inspecting. So that was why he was successful. That's very important. And you can see in this race, For a variety of reasons, Joe Biden is running as a virtual candidate. There's a lot of strategies that explain that, whether it's a quarantine or COVID, or he's got some cognitive issues if he comes out, or he can't really say things that will offend his base, but he can't say things that will offend the swing voter, and the two are antithetical, so it's better not to get into it. And he's ahead in the mainstream polls. But he suffers on the idea that Trump is exploiting that. Trump gets out and said, I took risk. I got the COVID. I didn't want to get it. I wasn't reckless. I got it. And what did I do? I took experimental drugs. They told me not to mix this thing with steroids. I just said, go ahead and do it. But whatever I do. And so he's got these huge rallies, and he's trying to say that 100 million people are growing food right now, and they're delivering fuel, and they're making stuff. And so people like me here in my farmhouse can order from Amazon, or I can stay here and just make one safe trip to this. But I couldn't do that if I was one of the muscular classes. So a leader's got to show solidarity with the people. And some do it very well. MacArthur did it very well for a while in World War II, but he was past his prime in the Korean War. And he was called, when he left troops in the Philippines at Corregidor, they called him Dugout Doug. I don't think that was a very fair assessment, because he was a brilliant commander, but I think he made a lot of strategic mistakes in Korea.
There are a couple of questions I'm going to put together here. One is, given the gutting of the Rust Belt and the outsourcing to China, does the USA still have the industrial capacity to win a war? And then another questioner asks, is a conflict between the US and China inevitable?
Well, we absolutely do, because one of the $64,000 questions of the 2016 is that Trump, he had to beat 15 great Republican, I mean, not great, but they were much better than the 2012 field, Chris Christie and Walker and Rubio and Cruz and all of these people, Carly Fiorina, Ben Carson. And how did he beat them? He took a traditional Republican, low taxes, strong defense, conservative judges, and he tweaked it. He said, we're going to get tough with China, that there's no reason they're fated to take over the world. We're going to close the border. We're not going to have any more optional expeditionary incursions into the Middle East. We don't need it anymore because we're going to have more gas and oil. But the signature issue was, why is Michigan and Wisconsin and Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania, why are they hollowed out? We've got the greatest workers. The energy costs are lower here than Europe or Asia. The transportation costs are lower for us. They're educated. It's just because this globalized project is asymmetrical in terms of trade, reciprocity, and we're going to change it. And before the COVID hit, I think there were signs that, whereas previous people said you need a magic wand or it's a fan, that was successful. And you can see that even though we got a late start on the COVID, we're testing 1 million people per day now, greater than any other country in the world. We've got more ventilators created. We don't know what to do with them. And so we were short on toilet paper. I went to the store the other day. There was just tons of sanitizer, whole islands of it. Nobody in their possible mind could. I mean, it was just, that's what America does. They did it in World War II. So no, we have that capacity. And wars are started by good intentions and naivete and a belief that human nature's changed, and they're prevented by a deterrence. That's what Vegetus said, the Roman military author. He who wants peace, prepare for war. And he was talking about classical deterrence. And we lost our deterrence with China because we said basically to them, if you run up huge trade deficits, if you steal our patents, if you steal our copyrights, if you dump your currency, if you violate health and safety laws, if you appropriate our technology with joint ventures, we're going to ignore it because you're going to get wealthier and more leisured. And in the process, you're eventually going to democratize. And they did not see it that way. They said, you know what? We think capitalism works, but it doesn't work with democracy. It works better with totalitarianism, we're going to get your technology and your so-called magnanimity, as I said earlier. It's a sign of weakness. It's not something to be reciprocated with. And so we, just like the COVID, we are waking up late, and now all of a sudden we're learning that they really need our food. They need our beef. They don't have anything comparable to our top 20 research universities. They don't produce food like we do. They're not the world's greatest producer of oil and natural gas. They don't have a stable constitutional system. They've got enormous moral, ethical, and public relations problems with the Uyghurs, the way they've treated them, the way they've treated Tibet, the way they've treated those in Hong Kong. And everybody, let me just finish by saying, to be a neighbor of China is to hate the Chinese now. Not the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist government. I mean that in the sense of, look at them. They've got India, nuclear India, that has a comparable population of 1/4, that's an enemy of them. They have South Korea, that's an enemy. They have Japan, that is an enemy. They have Taiwan, that's an enemy. They have Australia, that's an enemy. And they have us with bases surrounding them. And Russia is a convenient friend or enemy, depending on what they think is in their interest. So they're in a very poor strategic position. So yeah, we've woken up late. We're examining the 360,000 students here. We're examining the $6 billion our universities took as gifts, which was wrong. We're examining the infiltration of Chinese operatives in our research universities. So I think they're in a much more disadvantaged position than we are.
We have time maybe for one or two more questions. Here's one about memory of the war in Korea. How is the war remembered amongst South Koreans? Has that narrative changed as the conflict has receded into history?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would say I went to a conference in the 90s in Washington when the South Korean scholarly delegation was very anti-American, and I walked out of it because they were almost agreeing with some American leftist academics that said that it would have been better had they lost the war and they could have enjoyed the benefits of North Korea. And as I said, if you really believe that, then why are we here? You should just give up and join the North, and then we'll save a lot of money and we'll get our troops out. But that was right during the period of revisionism, where everybody were looking at this collateral damage from American bombing, or they were susceptible to propaganda from North Korea. And most importantly, they had an authoritarian government that was receding. Now you look 30 years later, they're democratic, they're affluent. The war is 70 years ago. And most importantly, the United States is not in the Cold War. The United States attitude is not any longer, we need those bases to check the Soviet Union. We need to help you, and we're going to tell you. Now the United States attitude is, we'll honor our commitments, but if you don't want us there, no problem with us. It's your country. You've got all this money. You run up a great trade deficit. Maybe you should get some oil from the Middle East. If you want oil from the Middle East to import, go get it, but don't rely on us to protect you and hold your hand. And that message has shocked the South Korean government. I say that as someone who talks a lot to a lot of South Korean diplomats and journalists. So it's no longer don't dare come into my country, but is please stay, because we're terrified of the North Koreans and the Chinese. We have a very wealthy, free society. We don't want to lose it, and we appreciate what you've done. And I think that pretty much summarizes most of the Pew International poll shows South Korea about 72% with approval rating of the United States and the Korean War. And that was not true in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It was about 40% approval. And so it's a sea change, I think.
Maybe we can take one more question here. Do you feel that if we had taken MacArthur's recommendation to, quote, finish the job, unquote, in Korea, we would have been successful? And do you feel we made the wrong decision in not doing so?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it requires a little cheating, because we know something from hindsight. So in March of 1951, MacArthur was relieved of command. And MacArthur, remember, was pretty quiet. He was chased back down October, November, December. And then Walton Walker, who was sort of a pretty good commander in World War II, but had been obedient to, he was killed. And he was very jealous of Matthew Ridgway, but he didn't quite voice it. He thought we needed to get out of, if you go back and look at the record, what he was saying, he said, we've lost it. The Joint Chiefs caved in. The Truman administration appeased them. Senator McCarthy's right. We've taken, the State Department's full of communists. We've lost. And then Ridgway came in, said, whoa, wait. We can win this thing. And got a lot more support from the Joint Chiefs and stabilized it. And then at that point, MacArthur said to Ridgway, we can go back up. And Ridgway said, I'll do whatever the Joint Chiefs, but I might end up where you are. I think at that point, they relieved MacArthur. Ridgway took his job, and they brought in another team. I think at that point, I'm talking about April 1950, yes, if they had wanted to go north with a little bit more sacrifice, I think they could have taken the entire country. B-29s had wrecked North Korean industry, bridges, roads. It was very hard to supply them from China. Americans had established air superiority in so-called MiG Alley. The United States had about a 7-to-1 nuclear edge in hydrogen weaponry. Curtis LeMay had reformulated the Strategic Air Command. It was light years ahead of the Soviet Union. In strategic weapons, it wasn't even close. So there was a sense that the Soviet Union thought that it was time to pull out and not support the North Koreans, and the communist Chinese felt they had been beaten, and if we wanted to go up there, we could have won. But the next question is where the debate goes. So we have united all of Korea, and we're going to have what, a demilitarized zone along the Yalu River next to 1.4 billion Chinese. And so it would have been a question, how much blood and treasure is the United States willing to invest in the next 50 years? Because you're going to have to unite the entire peninsula, and then you're going to have to protect it, and you're going to be right on the border of China and Russia. And who knows what's going to happen, how many little Korean incidents we were going to have. But yes, we could have united it. We would have paid a higher price. We wouldn't have the problem with North Korea today. But it was a decision of people that the American people would have not been willing to pay a 70-year-old price. I think they would have, because they've done it in Europe with Germany and the same issue. Are you willing to protect Germany? Are you willing to sacrifice New York and Washington and put Germany under the nuclear umbrella? So when the huge Red Army of the Soviet Union plows into West Germany, you say to Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev, if you don't call them off, because we couldn't stop them in a tactical conventional war, but we said to them, if you don't call it off, we're going to use nuclear weapons. And then we had such a sophisticated and varied nuclear force that they were scared. I think we could have done the same thing, but we were surely raising the stakes. I'll just end with something. Who didn't want us to do that? It was Churchill, the French, de Gaulle, most of our European allies. Although the British were very generous, they had over 100,000 troops rotate in and out. They lost 1,000 dead. But mostly the Europeans said, the Cold War is in Europe, and you're diverting half or 50, 60% of your strength to what? South Korea, that didn't even exist in World War II, and you're going to weaken your best allies. So they were very much against the Korean War in general, and the idea that we would try to make a major commitment to unify the peninsula and then disperse our nuclear deterrent on behalf of someone other than themselves. I'll just finish by saying that's the reality, but of course, it's very hard to get to the reality because it's cloaked with rhetoric, and the rhetoric is, you know, you're Yankee go home, and you're an imperialist, neo-colonialist, racist, sexist society. But you have to prune all that away and just look at what their strategic interests and what their diplomats said privately in their papers and their memoirs. And then you can see that they were pretty cynical about. They said, you know what, we'll publicly, de Gaulle will criticize America and the French will be full of anti-Americanism, the British, the Dutch, but privately, please, please, we don't want to defend ourselves. We don't want to contribute to NATO like we should. We can't do it. We're worn out psychologically, materially. Don't go over there and waste all those resources when this Red Army is going to invade. And so that had a powerful effect on the Truman and the Eisenhower administration.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hanson. And we have some great questions still in the Q&A queue. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for those, but I'm sure there will be, some of them relate to the election, and I'm sure there'll be lots of debate and discussion. I know there will be, both on campus and nationally about that. But we appreciate your coming to talk about the Korean War and your other discussions today. Next time, if everybody in Lewisburg, when you're at the Bucknell Athletic Center and you pass the bust to George Raymer's memory in the entrance to the Athletic Center at Bucknell, we all may know a little bit more about what that whole situation was of his death and his bravery and his winning the Medal of Honor, the context for that. So thanks again for giving that to us tonight. And this was brought to you by the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship. And if you're interested in more information about programming, be sure to email me or email dialogue2021@gmail.com. Again, thanks so much, Professor Hanson, and thanks to everybody who came.
Appreciate
it. Take care.